So then, if you awaken from this illusion,
Persistence of vision.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Persistence of Vision podcast, inspiring conversations. We read books, so you have to.
Yes, hello, I am Lance Fever Myers,
I'm LB Dio.
and this is Persistence of Vision. You should go to our website and check out what we got there. There's comics by world-class artists. There's essays and poetry by really, really great authors. There are links to our other podcasts that we've done with a huge plethora of wonderful guests. What else? We got links to our books, right? You have a book out.
Yeah, we have books out. My book is The Goddamn Fool, available now on Amazon. Your book is Why So Much?
Why indeed so much? Go check it out. Go to Amazon, and if you live in Austin, they're also available at Malvern Books on campus. So there you go.
Wonderful bookstore.
What else do we got going on?
Well, to our eternal pride, we have the great Mike O'Connor visiting us here today to discuss a book that he knows very well, A Theory of Justice by John Rawls. Mike O'Connor is so intelligent that he has 2 PhDs. Is that right?
No.
No.
I do have one PhD, though.
He has one
Only
PhD.
one?
And 2 master's degrees.
What have you been
2
doing with your
masters.
life?
Just slacking.
Slacking.
What is your degree and what is your PhD in?
I have a PhD in American Studies. I more recently have a master's in public affairs from the
Okay.
LBJ school. Yeah.
Fantastic.
Public affairs. My God. Well, we don't have to talk about your affairs. Certainly not when we're being recorded. But we would love to talk about you and your love of this book.
Sounds great.
And you have also written a book, haven't you, called A Commercial Republic? So we're talking to an author as well as a scholar.
That is so.
I can't wait.
All right.
Okay, so we ask our guests to sign up and to present a book. Why A Theory of Justice? Why did that one become your choice?
Well, biographically, it had a big effect on me. And as a historian, or I guess former historian at this point, I see it as playing an important role in the development of post-war American liberalism. In my view, it's that political liberals have a tough time making their case that it's fairly easy to see to their right. If you're like a libertarian, that resonates with Americans to some extent. If you say, well, I don't think you should take my property, most Americans say, I agree, you shouldn't take my property. And then there's sort of a, certain cases might push that one way or another, but the basic intuition, I think, holds for most Americans. If, to the far left, the socialists can say, well, capitalism is so unjust that we should really be committed to equality, and the only way to have equality is to have the state run the economy. And I think that also hits certain intuitions, at least for certain people, that equality is an important goal.
Yes.
For liberals, or what we more likely today call progressives, it's sort of like, well, I do think that economic inequality is important, but I don't think that we should take over the economy.
Mm-hmm.
Well, why not? Well, it's too often that liberals are cast as, and I think willingly cast themselves as, a halfway house, as like, well, we're just not as out there as the libertarians or as out there as the socialists. We're more sensible, and I actually don't think that that's compelling for anybody. I also don't think that it's an accurate reflection of their political commitments, and I think A Theory of Justice did a great job in 1971 of laying a philosophical framework for showing why progressive ideals are right. It's not just that other people are right, but they go too far. It's that the progressive ideals themselves are the correct ones to have.
I remember reading about the difference between the National Review and the Nation. Where the National Review is the right-wing publication, and the Nation is the left-wing. And the Nation is different because it is a home or a welcoming to more radical leftists as well as to liberals, whereas the National Review tries to just be mainstream conservative. So maybe that's a reflection of what you're talking about.
Yeah. Yeah, when did you read? Just out of curiosity, that seems
that was
like
decades
it
ago.
was true a long time ago.
Yeah. When they were founded, that was the idea.
of those particular publications. Yeah.
Yes.
Right. Well, and you mentioned like, okay, when are you reading these things? And I think, and tell me your opinion about this. And this may be veering away from the book itself, but times have changed.
Right.
Times are a changing.
Right.
Continually. I mean, for the past 3 years or so, radically different than they were during the Obama administration. And do you think that has an effect on how people discuss these things?
I think it should, or I might even flip it around and say how people discuss these things should have an effect on the current. I mean, in particular, what I'm thinking about in a crass but easily accessible way is, I mean, people right now are voting Democratic are trying to decide between Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. I think you could make too much of the fact that he's a socialist and she's not. I'm not sure their actual policies would be all that amazingly different in real life.
Yeah.
Nonetheless, he's a socialist and she's not. And so I think that you can see in Warren's position in particular, there's a little talking point or a little thing she hits on her stump speech most of the time that she first said, I don't know, 7 or 8 years ago, where she says, if you're an entrepreneur, that's fantastic, but you shipped your product on state-sponsored roads and you used workers that were educated in the public schools and so on and so on and so on. And
but there's no such thing as a self-made.
Yeah, I mean, and that's straight out of Rawls. Like I like so much so that I literally believe that she intentionally is summarizing Rawls. I mean, I don't know that. It could be wrong, but it's like that's exactly his argument.
Well, tell us this argument. What is
Okay.
the thesis of this book?
Let's do that. The thesis of this book, to boil it down really, I don't know how to end that sentence. To boil it down a great deal, is social and economic inequality should be arranged to the benefit of the least advantaged. That's where he summarizes it. It's 580-something pages. But I think it's more important to sort of ask about what that means or why. So it's you guys' podcast. You can stop me whenever, but I'm gonna.
Let us have it.
Okay. So what Rawls says is he's operating in this philosophical tradition. He's a philosopher, and he says, I want to examine the notion of what a truly just society would be. And he's got this, centuries of philosophical discourse before him where people have offered different arguments and so on. And he wants to sort of update that a little bit and tweak it. So the question, of course, is when I tell you I think this society is just, there's no real way to check the answer like it is if I say what's the temperature, except when I tell you that, you go, that does sound just, right?
Right.
And that's not a very good
It's very
test.
subjective
Yeah,
feeling,
it's too subjective. So he wants to try to take, if you're familiar with the sort of social contract idea from philosophers like Hobbes and Locke, and tweak it a little bit so it's not just about your intuitions, but it's actually something you could argue about with somebody else. And so what he says is, let's imagine that we put a bunch of people in a room, right? It could be a room just like this. It could be people just like us, let's say, to make it easy.
Sure.
And we give them the job of designing an ideal society, an ideally just society, that is. And then in order to sort of bring his little tweak in that changes the whole thing, he says, but there's one catch, and that's that none of these people know anything about themselves. So this is the hypothetical. It's not realistic to not know anything about yourself.
Yeah.
But by some, you can imagine technology or a magic spell or whatever you want. But they literally don't know. Like, they can't look at their own hands and say, oh, I must be such and such a race,
He had a name like Point of Origin or something like that. Is that the name of it?
The Veil of Ignorance.
Veil of Ignorance.
Well, I thought there was
The original position.
original position.
The whole
that's it.
thing is
Right.
called the original
Yes,
position.
yes.
The specific device is
Right.
called the Veil of Ignorance. And so the idea is that Rawls says is that your job, right, if you're in the original position, is not specifically to design the ideal society, even though I said that a minute ago. That was a misstatement. Your job is to design the society that's best for you, right? but you don't know anything about yourself.
Right.
And so what he says is, if everyone's trying to design a society that's best for themselves, but no one knows anything about themselves, they will inevitably design a society that's the most just, because that's basically the best you can do. You can't rig the game in your favor because you don't know who you are. So, I mean, easy sort of low-hanging fruit, obvious example. If for some reason some person said, I think all the white people should be at the top of the pyramid in this society, first of all, no one would say that because they don't know if they're white. But everybody else would say, well, I don't know if I'm white, so that's a stupid bargain. I'm not going to take that. They would vote it down, right?
Yeah.
So the really obvious things that are unjust, racism and sexism and so on, would not be included in a perfectly just society, which of course does correspond with our intuitions, right? So
this is really the divider-chooser method of apportionment, right? This is the idea that if you, or at least that's an attempt to do the same thing, where if you are going to cut a piece of cake for someone and for yourself,
right,
and you say the person who cuts is not the person who chooses which piece he gets. Well, that means that the person who cuts has to try to cut them as equally as possible, because if he cuts one smaller than the other person is going to choose the bigger piece.
That's exactly, yeah. And the idea is that Rawls has is that we are not, like the engine that drives this process is not altruism. It's not your sense of justice, which might be different from one society to the next. It's your selfishness.
Self-interest.
And your self-interest. And we like to believe, and this is of course one of the criticisms of the book, that self-interest might also be culturally grounded and might not look the same everywhere and so on. But we like to believe that that's a straight up calculation, that if someone does something that's not actually to the benefit of their self-interest, we just call that irrational.
Let's do it.
Right? And so these are rational people pursuing their rational ends, right?
Yes.
And so, the sort of paradigmatic case in this book is economic inequality, right? I mean, racial justice and so on, it just kind of gets checked off really fast because it's pretty obvious that you're going to have that in the society. And so Rawls says, again, these people are interested in their own self-interest, to be circular, their own agenda, whatever you want to call it. And so what you have to ask them, or what they would be asked, is, what kinds of property would you be allowed to have in this just society? How would you be able to earn money? How would you be able to divide up the
resources?
Right, yeah. The production, et cetera, of this society. And what he says, and I think the easiest way to understand it is the idea that given these constraints, we would divide them equally is such an obvious idea, like the cake, right? Like you just mentioned, that it would probably be the first thing they would think of,
It's
right?
like a mathematical idea.
That everyone gets the same. And that's what socialism is, right? Is that equality is the highest political virtue, and we need to sort of always have an eye on that and always have committed to that. Nonetheless, Rawls says they would reject that. And the reason why is because if everyone's trying to get the most for themselves, it is not necessarily true, although it might seem like it is true at first, that the way to get the most for yourself is to make sure that everyone else has exactly the same as you.
It's to cut the cake exactly.
Right. Because,
half.
and then here's where the cake metaphor breaks down, right? It's because of economic growth, right? If it were possible, right? If you imagine there's scenario A and scenario B. Scenario A, there's three of us at this table, and we all have exactly the same. Scenario B, we say, let's allow LB to start a company, and if he makes a bunch of money, he can hire us both. And then we're all better off than we were without the company. And Rawls is at such a high level, he doesn't really care. We wouldn't be passing rules about whether LB can start a company. We would be passing rules about whether companies can exist, whether private property would exist, like really high level stuff.
Yeah.
And so if it were possible that LB could start this company, we could work for him and make more money, then in fact we would all be better off than if we all split the equal pie.
Yeah.
And so, and then this is when I used to teach this book. Like, this is where I always struggled with my students, because I'd be like, "Would you take this or that? Scenario A or scenario B?" And there were a lot of people usually not a majority, but a sizable minority who would say, "I'm not taking B because just fuck that guy," you know. I just don't want him to have more than me. And I'm like, yeah, but that's not.
That could be you for one thing.
It could be you for one thing, right? But also, it's not rational. It's not pursuing your rational self-interest, right? Your only goal is to get more than you have.
Yeah.
Right. And again, this is a place where people have criticized Rawls. They've said basically he defines everything away. Anything choice that someone else might say, he says, well, that's just not rational, so it doesn't count.
Oh, I see. Sure.
I don't think that's a fair criticism, but it's frequently made. And so...
well, it's not a fair criticism, right? Because he's giving us a framework not to find an obvious answer, but to reason about this and determine what the best system is.
Exactly. And so then the question is in real life is how... Like, we won't always know. I mean, LB could start a company and then have a really terrible idea and lose a bunch of money, and we're out on the street, in which case we would have been better off in scenario A, right? So we don't really always know that's going to happen, or how. We don't always have a mechanism by which individual people's actions will distribute things fairly, or alternatively, he could do really well and just be a robber baron and exploit us as workers, and then we still also would have been better off if everything was split equally, even if the pie itself was still smaller. All those things can happen. So what do we do to make sure that social and economic inequalities, like in other words, anytime there is an inequality, it's got to work for the benefit of the person on the bottom. That's the thesis I mentioned earlier. Right?
Yes.
So we allow the inequality of LB being our boss and the owner of the company with us just being workers because we as workers are better off. Well, what if that doesn't always happen? Well, the way that we make sure that it happens is we tax the shit out of LB and we give the money to the people who did not win, right? So this is what I was leading up to all the way from the beginning. This is the sort of conventional progressive liberal position, right? That like in order to bring about social justice, not necessarily equality, but justice, you need to have a fairly robust state that is taking money from the winners and giving it to the losers. I mean, that's an overstatement and not very elegant, but that's basically what he says.
Right, yeah.
And the reason why he says that is because the only reason why people are allowed to own those companies is because that production can work to the benefit of the least advantaged. If it didn't work to the least advantaged, in other words, if we allowed the inequality but didn't have the redistributive mechanism,
right?
Well, then
we never would have chosen that in the first place.
We never would have chosen that, and so it's unjust, right? That's exactly the point, right? So it's unjust. Like, so all of this is really the original position is never going to happen. So
sure.
It's really just a device for us to
thought
figure
experiment.
out.
Yeah, right.
It's a device for us to figure out what our intuitions actually are, and so what he's saying is your intuitions actually are. Inequality should not be allowed to exist unless they work to the benefit of everyone.
Right. So, Rawls winds up saying that he's agnostic on the question of capitalism versus socialism.
He does say that, which always surprises me a little bit. But yeah, he does. He does. Even though I think that he does say that equality is not the political goal. That justice is not synonymous with equality.
Fairness is.
Right.
He's talking about fairness.
Right. I mean, he actually calls justice as fairness. That's how he defines it, as opposed to, I realize this many, many years later, as opposed to justice as some particular embodiment of what you already thought before you started considering the question, like, yes. If you're a Marxist, justice is, the workers ruling the state. You know what I mean? like that.
Yeah. Well, that's one of the challenges to the whole concept, right? Is that he's saying, okay, we can have a basis for determining what is a just society, provided that we accept certain ideas about what justice means, and someone else in that original situation might say, wait a second, I object to the whole thesis here because I don't think that fairness or justice means equal distribution or can be distributed.
Right. That's exactly right. Yeah.
Yeah, it is interesting the use of the word justice or fairness, because to me they seem fairly synonymous.
That's his point, though. That's his point. That's his point. That's synonymous.
Yeah.
Whereas If I walked into not into the original position, but if I walked into, say, the book, outside of the real world as a philosopher, and I said, justice is always when people are the most free. Justice is always when people are the most equal, or something like that. Yeah. And then he's saying you stack the deck, and you pretty much predicted what answer you're going to get.
Right.
And so by saying justice is fairness, he's using a very neutral word that doesn't in some ways mean anything once you've already said justice.
I mean, a clear challenge to this, obviously, whether it makes any sense or not, would be to someone a scenario where, let's say, I'm the one who starts the company, but what if I were one of the worst off to begin with, and I somehow managed to acquire a company, and then you're taxing me the same way that you were taxing me to redistribute my money that I've managed to earn, the same way as if I had been one of the wealthy people in the original distribution of things, right?
Right, but what Rawls would say is he's concerned about. Calls these the basic institutions of society. Like he's not coming up with a theory that's going to judge particular cases. So,
right.
So the fact is, like, if you were one of the worst off, and then you got to be one of the better off, he would still make the same argument. Like you couldn't, you might not have been able to go from the bottom to the top if you were born in, the favelas of Rio instead of in the U.S. or, like there's so many things that other people, is that the right word, by the way? Favela? I shouldn't have said words I don't really know very well. But
the slums of Rio are notoriously
right.
Not only impoverished but violent.
Right. And so he's going to argue that even if you were, worse off than someone else who started better off, you still got to that place, and you got to that place with the help of the rest of society.
Well, all I'm saying is that, he may be right about that. He may be absolutely correct, but nevertheless, as a person in the original position, I might disagree and have a different idea of what fairness means.
Right.
I might say, no, that's not fair. You can't do that. That's not fair.
Right.
But I keep getting tripped up on this idea that this book centers around justice, because to me it seemed more in line with just figuring out how to structure a system that raises quality of life in the best way.
Right.
But he's saying that that's the just thing to do.
Okay. Fair enough.
No,
but
he's saying I think more specifically that people wouldn't shut down the possibility of making the pie bigger just because they won't have as much of the pie. So, basically he's saying, and I think
sort of reevaluating the thought behind what is justice or what is fair.
Right. He's saying, in other words, if you have 5 units of whatever, 5 units, and tomorrow you could have 6, but you also at that point went from having 1% of society's goods to 0.5%, he's saying you would always rather have 6 than 5. And you can. There
was a social, some experiment, and I'm not going to get it right, so sorry, but it's something about how there was a experiment where they had the test subject was given the opportunity to give their partner $100.
Yeah.
You know what I'm talking about? And then
about
and they
as well
get
as you
25.
do, I think.
Yeah. Or neither gets anything. And it's something like that. I mean, the
people
dynamic,
would rather get nothing and have the other person get nothing,
right,
than give the other person 100 and receive 5.
Right. Yes.
They would actually rather.
I mean,
just
I don't know that was
the entire thing.
I don't know that was the result.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah. Okay. So it's $100. And
so
$5.
I would rather have nothing and have you have nothing than have you have $100 and me have $5.
Yeah.
Or $1 or whatever.
Which would be exactly the opposite of Rawls's.
That's right.
His point, but again, then he would,
But this is a philosophical.
Some would say he defined
but
it
that's
away.
irrational
that's
thinking.
Irrational,
really
so
is.
That's not what we would bring to the original position.
Yeah.
And again, you could say, well, if everybody does it all the time, and that's a well-established principle of human thinking, then maybe you can't just define it away like that.
Well, but there probably is a threshold of, and it might not be quite as black and white as that, because in the real world, you would examine all possibilities and say, okay, let's make a deal. You're giving him 100, you're giving me 5. If I'm the one who gets to say whether this happens or not, I'd rather it be 60-40, or you know what I mean. There may be
that's exactly it.
threshold.
And you do that through the mechanism of the state because it's very hard not to do this, but we're doing it. Like, you always wind up talking about Rawls. You get into this idea that there's like two people and they're bargaining, and like we're just setting up the society, because you're already, if you say 60-40, you're implying that I know I have 60. You know, like, we don't know any of that. We're just like, if some hypothetical person later on down the road happens to have 60, like, how much would I really care about that? In that visceral way that you're sort of bringing it up, you know?
Yeah, sure.
Probably not very much, but you would say, like, if it strikes you as unfair that this would happen, then you say, well, we put that in the state. We put that in the mechanism of the state to say, if people gain that much money, or if they gain money that way, or if whatever it is, we think they have to give some back and redistribute it to other people.
Right.
So the book, A Commercial Republic, is your book that you came out with.
It is.
Is it related to A Theory of Justice, or is it?
Ish. There's about 10 pages on A Theory of Justice in there. I tried to, like I said, I was an intellectual and political historian for a while, and so what it is the book is it's a consideration of different theories of how the United States has intervened in the economy. So it's what I would maybe now call economic development, after having gone to policy school throughout history. So it's designed to sort of argue against the libertarian notion that the government didn't do anything in the economy until the New Deal. I think that's just totally false. And so I position Rawls later in the book, much in the same way that I did here, as a guy who clearly articulated some of the principles of post-war liberalism better than I think most actual post-war liberals actually did. Traditionally, if you took Rawls in a philosophy class or something, he's seen as the guy who put political philosophy back on the map in the United States after people sort of forgotten about it because utilitarianism had become so important. I think that's true, but it's not what interests me as much. You know?
Right.
So it sounds like you're a fan.
I'm a fan. I am a fan, yeah.
Do you feel like if our listeners out there, all the millions and millions of voters who are listening to this podcast, were to read Rawls, we'd be a better off society?
Oh, without a doubt.
Okay.
Yeah,
Well, it's interesting that we have a president who is a very fervent admirer of Rawls, and Bill Clinton.
Oh, okay.
Who Bill Clinton
had a president.
Had.
Then. You
We had.
confused me. I was
We
like,
had,
what are
yes.
you talking about?
And Bill Clinton was said that he was the greatest political philosopher of the 20th century, and had him to dinner at the White House repeatedly.
I didn't know that either.
Yeah.
When did you first discover this book in Rawls?
I was assigned this book in college, which would have been, 1988 or something like that. It was a seminar. I was a philosophy major, and they, all the juniors had to do a seminar on one book. And so I remember being in this room, and there were two seminars, and one was on Rawls and one was on free will, and all the philosophy majors were in this room. And I had never heard of the book. The professor teaching it sort of explained what it was about, and I was like, that sounds more interesting to me than the one on free will, which was the other one. Everyone else seemed to feel the same way because everyone was going to the other side of the room to sort of choose, and so they had to have like a lottery or something.
Exercising their free will.
Exactly, that's true. I never really thought about that. But also trying to get into the society that would come after they were gone. Right, the class hadn't started yet, so and I just got lucky. I got in the lottery, and got to take the class, and so I really, I think we would read like 12 pages for each class or something. It was a very, very detailed examination of this particular book, and I do remember when I first read it, I didn't really like it.
Oh, really?
It is a bit of a tough read.
It's a tough read, but I also thought in general that his, I thought like he was trying to ground it in something that he didn't really offer. I'm like, well, why? Who cares what these people would choose, and why does that make it right, and so on. And I later came around to see that he's not offering that. He's like, it doesn't. He's not Kant. He's not trying to say that this is rooted or grounded in some nature of politics. He's just saying, don't you agree that that's what they choose? And if not, tell me why not.
Yeah.
And I think once I got over that, I became a much bigger fan. But I've actually read the book 3 times. I went back to grad school and read it again, and then I read it again for the book. So it's it becomes a little bit more illuminating each time, mostly because I slowly, I will find actual quotes of things that I sort of knew that Rawls thought but had never pinned down because other people had told me or because I read it somewhere, and then I would finally, it really is in the book, which is always a mild relief because sometimes I'm afraid I just go off and think things are true and they're not.
I'm quite sure you've become much more acquainted with the book now that you teach it, right? I mean, usually tends to be the case.
Yeah.
And where do you teach?
I don't teach anymore.
Oh, okay.
But
okay,
I
gotcha.
did. I taught at New York Institute of Technology. I taught at Penn State Erie. I taught at Georgia State in Atlanta for a while, and then I could not get on the tenure track ever, and it made me very cranky. So I decided to come back to Austin and get my public policy degree.
Fantastic.
Very nice. So we have to do our lightning round, but before
Okay.
I want to very quickly ask you about Anarchy, State, and Utopia
you
by
do?
Nozick.
Yeah.
That book was written as a kind of an attempt to refute or at least address
Refute, I think
this
it's fair.
particular book.
I think it's fair. Yeah.
And it's credited with a lot of being fairly important in the libertarian
Yes,
movement.
it is.
What are your thoughts about that book? I have not read it.
I was nodding vigorously, and then I remembered that people can't see me do that. So yes, in fact, that is true. Everything you said is true. I guess for the benefit of your listeners in time, I will not now summarize that book. So that's not going to be fair to Nozick, but it's a pretty clever book. It's very smart. He does a great job of where Rawls has this one big initial position, and then he crams 100 things in it over 500 pages. Anarchy, State, and Utopia is, I would think, maybe 200 if that. It's I wouldn't say breezy, but it's really easy to read. He's really good at thinking of different examples that illustrate the point. I mean, the one I remember, for example, is he's like, imagine there's an island. There's like a desert island where people have crashed, and there's a certain number of men and a certain number of women, and they all have to. They're stuck on this island, and so they're pairing off, right? And if he says that, and let's just assume that the men are all, it's completely consensual among every resident of this island, which person is most desirable, which is second most desirable, third. So if the men are A, B, C, D, E, and the women are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you're going to say, well, obviously A is going to pair with 1, and B is going to pair with 2, and so on. So if you're D, you really want 1. And he's like, at what point do you get to say that an injustice was done, right? Who did the injustice if you can't get that thing that you want, and then you have to settle for the 4th choice instead of your first choice? And it's like, it's hard to give a good response to that because we've all been D or whoever I was talking about. We've all been D, and it feels really unfair that you can't get things that you want. But these are free people making free choices, as a libertarian would characterize the economy, right? Free people making free choices. And so and he's like 100 of those examples, and they're all really clever.
Got a Will Chamberlain.
The Will Chamberlain is the most famous one, which I don't think we want to get into now, or do we?
Look it up, folks.
Yeah, look it up.
Will
Exactly.
Chamberlain takes a major place in political philosophy in the United States.
He does. And I think the last thing I
Actually, he works with the other thing too.
Yeah.
20,000.
That's true. And then just the thing that I would point out though, that Rawls might respond to that. Nozick was always mad that Rawls never rigorously or systematically responded to Nozick's book because they were both on the philosophy department at Harvard at the same time. So I always think that's really weird that they would walk by each other like getting lunch or something, and he's like, "Hey, you got to respond to my book." Well, screw you, Nozick. I don't know.
Did you see that book I wrote?
Yes.
I wrote a book too.
So, and what Rawls says that I think is really interesting is that our notion of dessert is rooted in a certain intuition that we don't realize we don't apply consistently. So in other words, we would all pretty much say, I hope we would, that something you can't control, like the color of your skin or your gender or whatever, shouldn't play a major role shouldn't play any role maybe in how much stuff you have, basically, right?
Yes.
Shouldn't impede your ability to get work, shouldn't impede your ability to be paid the same as someone else, and so on. But if the reason for that is that this is something you cannot control, then he's like, most of the things that we do want to distribute property on the basis of are also things you cannot control.
Right.
And this is where I think intuitions break down. Like Rawls wants to say, he actually does say, your ability to work hard, your willingness to work hard has a lot to do with the family you grew up in. So
yes.
Even if one person worked really hard and made a bunch of money, like the fact that they maybe just stipulate did work way harder than the person who sat on their ass all the time and smoked weed. Like, he's like, I don't care, right? Because that second person might have worked just as hard if they had a different family upbringing.
Well, now you are talking about free will and the idea of do you actually have the choice to make?
He's making an assertion about free will, saying we don't. We don't have. Yeah. We are born with and without capacities.
Without the capacity to work that hard or to.
I think he's more saying that that social structures have a serious role to play.
Sure.
In even our personality traits.
But even things like that aren't social, like how good looking you are, is something that you are born with that is not socialized. It's not anything. It's just chance, and there it is, and it has a huge impact in your life outcome.
Right. Although I think that how good looking you are, at least theoretically, most people would say that's sort of like race. That shouldn't play a role. Whereas I think most intuitions are how hard you're willing to work.
Yeah, or how smart you are.
Yeah, or how smart you are should play a role. And Rawls is like, honestly, that's every bit as arbitrary as anything else. Mm-hmm. And so he has a fairly, again, at the very beginning when I said like liberalism looks like this halfway house between the rigorous intellectual commitments of libertarianism and of socialism, like I don't think that's true. I think he's saying that, in fact, socialization goes so deep that there's almost no limit to what we should correct for with the social mechanisms of the state, the redistributive mechanisms of the state.
All right. What is that sound in the distance? Is that thunder?
That's thunder.
Is that lightning?
It's coming. Here we go.
The lightning round is here.
Mike, are you ready?
Okay, I'm as ready as I'm going to be.
Okay, here we go. Tell us about the first time you fell in love with a book.
Oh, boy. This might be wrong, but the first one I can remember is Watership Down.
Okay, sure.
When I was a kid, my parents took me... Oh, yeah, you'd probably be into this. Yeah, my parents took me to the movie. Not the Netflix one. They just, obviously, that was really good. But this was the earlier one from the 70s.
Yeah,
I
John Hurt.
Did not know that there was a book or anything, but they had it around the house because I guess a lot of parents in the 70s did.
Right.
And, so I took it home and I read it, and then I read it probably 3 times total. And it's a pretty fat book for a kid. But yeah, really, it made a huge impression on me. I always tried to figure out what exactly it was trying to say, and I never really did, which is, I guess, a good way to make people read your book again.
Yes.
Right.
But I felt really keenly that it was trying to say something.
And that was enough.
I think that's right. I think that's right.
Loving it.
Yeah, yeah.
All right, good
Excellent.
answer. Has a book ever changed your mind about anything?
Oh, without a doubt. Well, I mentioned earlier that A Theory of Justice actually...
Sure.
Well, I guess technically it didn't change. I changed my mind about it. It might be more accurate. But later I encountered a philosopher by the name of Richard Rorty.
Philosophy is the mirror of nature.
Philosophy in the mirror of nature. That's right. And not to make too fine a point on it, but I up to that point would have said I was some sort of a Platonist or a realist, and that I believe very much in the objective, independent nature of reality. And after I read Rorty, I sort of didn't.
Wow.
And so that was a pretty big deal.
Well, this is sort of a larger version of that question. Has a book ever changed your life?
Yes, because, and I was saving that because it changed my life. Whether or not you adopt a different philosophical position, I think you can argue is or is not a change in your life. But what I can tell you is that when I read Rorty, and he basically argued that most of philosophy is a quest to find this nature of things that it doesn't really exist and that we're never going to find, I dropped out of the philosophy program.
Wow. Okay.
And I went into American Studies and wrote him a letter and told him I was doing that, and sent him my thesis that I wrote on him, because I still had to get my master's in philosophy, and I had to write a thesis to have something to show for that time. Mm-hmm. And he wrote me back and said that he looked forward to reading my thesis, which I doubt he ever did. But this is the part I remember, and I've kept that letter ever since, and it's probably 20 years old now. Yeah. And it said, "I sometimes wish I'd gone into American Studies myself."
Wow.
Yeah, exactly.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay. Well, has a book ever made you cry?
I'm sure, probably a lot, but I'm having a hard time thinking of an example right now. Like, it's pretty easy to make me cry, to be honest.
We're planning on it, my friend. We are planning on it.
You're running out of time. You better get to it soon.
Okay. Name a book you've read more than. I think you've already done this. Name a book you've read more than once.
A different book you've read.
Yeah, let's say Watership Down and Theory of Justice. Book I've read more than once. I used to, when I was a kid, I still am a big Star Trek fan.
Okay.
And so I used to get all these Star Trek books from the library. They were numbered, where they literally just wrote up they novelized
every
episode, which now I think that was so stupid. Why didn't I read those? But I couldn't put them down, and I just go to the library and I would check them out again, and I'd check them out again, check them out again. On my own bookshelf at home, I had maybe 2 feet by 3 feet or something.
Wait, you're telling me there's a novel of every Star Trek episode?
Yeah, they're written by a guy named James Blish.
Wow.
And they're just called Star Trek 1, Star Trek 2, Star Trek 3, and each has, if I recall, 3 episodes in it, maybe.
Mm-hmm. Wait, how each episode was 30 minutes?
An hour.
Wait, and we're talking about the original Star Trek.
Yeah.
Really, they were an hour?
Yeah.
Okay.
Captain Kirk, Platonist or Aristotelian?
Platonist. McCoy's definitely a Platonist. That's tough, though. That is really tough.
What about Spock?
No, Spock's all mystical. Like, that's the weird thing about it. That's why he's an interesting character, because he's so logical, which seems very Platonist to me, whereas Aristotle's more likely to sort of take the measure
empirical
of all the different variables. And I'm actually going back to thinking maybe Kirk is Aristotelian, but Spock also has that weird mystical side to him, which might be more like Pythagorean or something if we have to be ancient Greeks. I don't know. And he's a vegetarian.
Of course we have to.
I think he's a Pythagorean. I'm gonna stick with that.
I like that.
I'm still over here just reeling at the idea of a novel for every episode.
Yeah. Well, it's a novel for every three episodes, I believe.
I see.
And then after that, now maybe what you're thinking of, again, being an animator, they had cartoon Star Trek in the 70s for one season, if I recall. And they also put out novelizations of those.
Is that right?
And those were called Star Trek Log 1, Star Trek Log 2, instead of just Star Trek 1, Star Trek 2. Those might have been by Blish. I want to say it's by Alan Dean Foster. I don't know. But so you can look at those too.
Interesting.
But you can also watch the Star Trek animated series on Netflix right now, if I'm not mistaken.
That one?
Yeah.
From the 70s?
Yeah. I realize now, because I was a kid when I watched it, and the animation's not very good.
No.
Yeah.
I do remember it not being very good.
Yeah, what I read somewhere online, because I went back and watched them when they got on Netflix. I hadn't seen them in 25 years, and what I read, someone online said, when their chins don't go down when they speak, their mouths just open, and I was like, well, that's impossible. How could I not have been bothered by that? But I'm really bothered by it now when I see that.
Love it.
Okay, here comes the $1 million question.
Okay.
The big one.
Okay.
Do you have any poetry committed to memory?
Almost, but no. Technically, no.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's fine. That's
Yeah.
fine. You're in good company. There's a lot of guests who have not.
I do have a favorite poem.
What's that?
It is by Walt Whitman, and it is called To a Certain Cantatrice. And it's very short, and I could almost memorize it, but I haven't.
Gotcha.
And it does actually. That's an answer to your other question. Every time I read it, it makes me cry.
Oh.
I was going to read it at the Dionysium once, but I thought I couldn't get through it without crying, and that might be moving.
You don't want to
It
cry in
also
front of
wouldn't-
Graham Reynolds.
Yeah, it wouldn't be. It might be. It might be moving, but it also wouldn't be very a good presentation of things. So I backed down on it and read some other Whitman.
Okay. Fantastic.
Mike O'Connor, ladies and gentlemen, his book is A Commercial Republic, America's Enduring Debate Over Democratic Capitalism. We've just been discussing that. We've been discussing Watership Down, Star Trek, and of course, especially A Theory of Justice by Rawls. So all of these books should be of interest to you, and you should read them all. And if you don't, you'll be very, very sorry.
It's been delightful. Thank you, Mike.
Thanks for
Thank
having
you,
me.
Mike. What a pleasure.
Okay, well, Persistence of Vision Publishing, POV-publishing.com. I think we didn't even give the address earlier, but it is POV-publishing.com. There you can read comics, essays, poetry. You can see links to all our podcasts and links to go pick up my book, Why So Much by Lance Myers, LB's book, The Goddamn Fool. Go do it. And we'll
review our books on Amazon.
Yes,
Damn
do
your
that.
eyes.
Do that. Please do. Buy them, review them, and buy an extra copy for a friend.
Yeah, your friends need these books,
That's right.
and they need a commercial republic.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks.